Welcome to The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week I'm joined by Jared Diamond of the Wall Street Journal to talk about his new book, Swing Kings. So, first question, I guess, is where were you supposed to be today?
Oh, goodness. Where was I supposed to be? That's a great question. The baseball season would have been going on this would be like the third week already, which is remarkable to think about. I'd probably be here. I'd probably be home in New York, I would think. I'm hoping by now the idea of following the Astros around would have gone away and I wouldn't still need to be doing that. I would have exhausted every single Astros-related story in the first 2 weeks of the season, and I'd be back in New York now, probably going to the ballpark this afternoon. The Mets were supposed to be home against the Braves, so I'm guessing I would have probably been out at Citi Field at some point today in the Braves clubhouse talking about a really good baseball team.
God, I forgot about that Astros story. That's how long March was, that the Astros went from the thing to like, oh yeah, that was a story we were talking about. That's crazy to think about.
That was the biggest story in sports for basically weeks. When everything shut down, that was basically the biggest story in sports was the Astros. Did they use buzzers and what was going to happen with them? Baseball was on fire. That all feels so irrelevant now, which is weird. I hope we get to a point at some point in the future where booing the Astros and debating that is the biggest story in sports again, because that means things in the world are much better than they are now.
Right. I was wondering, so kind of off that a little bit, what were some of the Astros related stories that you and your editors were kind of planning on doing or thinking of doing before in the before times, I guess?
Well, obviously we've been writing about this story. I think we've been I'm hoping at the forefront of this story for a while now. The big question now was going to be, all right, there's going to be games. What was going to happen? They were going to have to face a road crowd finally for the first time. What was that going to be like? Were they going to get booed? Were they going to get thrown at by other players? Because if you remember, there was a lot of sort of player-on-player crime as it relates to the Astros that we've never really seen before, with other players like ripping them publicly. Would that have been a thing? So there was a lot of sort of really interesting questions in that regard.
So what's it like for you now? We'll get to the book in a second. There's a lot of stuff I want to talk about with your new book. But what's it like being a baseball writer now? I mean, there's no games. Obviously, there's news happening, and you've written some fantastic stories about kind of the business of baseball and some of the things going around the game. But what's it like for you being a baseball writer when there's no baseball?
It's been much busier than you'd expect. I think I could start with that. I don't know if that's a Wall Street Journal thing or it's everybody. I can only speak for myself. But the way Wall Street Journal covers sports, this is sort of what we were designed for, is to cover a big story like this and to mobilize and to be all hands on deck for all of this time. It's been now, it feels like at least a month where we've been going at this pace. There's a lot of news. It's sort of an endless barrage of news in terms of how sports and sports business is impacted by this. Baseball alone is an $11 billion business, just about. And covering an unprecedented event in that regard, it has so many tentacles on the business side, on the performance side, and everything in between. And eventually, hopefully, we get to a place where things are starting again. And when that happens, it's going to be insane once again, because now there's all these questions about what it's like to start back up after this giant apparatus shuts down. So look, obviously, if we're shut down, if sports are shut down for a year or years, eventually I imagine it'll be harder to find stuff to write about. But I think it's so far I could actually probably say I wouldn't mind if there was a little bit less.
So, and in addition to covering the baseball for the Journal, you've got a book out. Came out a couple of weeks ago, Swing Kings. Read part of it. Haven't read the whole thing yet, but I did read part of it, and it's so far super entertaining and super fun. So I asked your friend and fellow baseball writer / author Jesse Doherty this question last week, so I wanted to talk to you about it. What's it like releasing a book about baseball in the middle of a global pandemic?
Not what you dreamed up when you started, I'll say that. I mean, I sold this project over 2 years ago, and we had this dream release that it was going to come out, right around opening day, and it was going to be a big thing. And then, of course, there's no baseball, and the world is a very different place. than what we thought. So I guess you could say that's frustrating. I'm not going to lie. It's not ideal. It's not ideal for sales. It's not ideal for your ego, because you want to be feeded, and no one's doing much feeding right now because no one could go out. So these are legitimate issues. But at the same time, I also recognize that people are inside and need something to do and something to read, and people miss baseball. I know I certainly do. So the idea of being able to give people a taste of baseball when everyone's missing it, I think there's value there. And I hope that for those who are in the position to, I know not everyone's really in the position to just buy a book right now. It's that taste of baseball that we miss.
So tell us a little bit about the book, and kind of start off with the kind of big idea. And I'm interested where the idea for you to write a book about kind of the home run revolution, and kind of framing it around the swing came from. Obviously, it's been a huge story in baseball for the last couple seasons, the number of home runs and that. But kind of where did that idea and you and book where did those roads all converge?
It's interesting. It's crazy to say, but it really did start for me the first year I was covering baseball. Not the book necessarily, but sort of my interest in this idea. I first started covering baseball for the Journal in 2013. I was covering the Mets at the time, and that off season between 12 and 13, that first winter I was on the beat, the Mets signed Marlon Byrd to a minor league contract, and it was not a very notable signing. No one paid attention to it, including I didn't even think I wrote about it when it happened. It was that sort of insignificant. But it was interesting because if you were a Mets fan, then you'll remember what happened. Marlon Byrd made the team. He, by the middle of May, was the Mets cleanup hitter, and frankly had an incredible season. He was just amazing that year. And I was so fascinated by this. And this guy was 35 years old. He had been coming off a steroid suspension. His career looked over. He had never been a power hitter, to say the least. And I spent much of the season asking him, "Hey, man, like, what's your deal? How are you doing this?" And he really didn't say. He was very coy about it. Didn't really want to acknowledge it until later in the year. The Mets traded him to the Pirates. That I think August. It was before the second trade deadline, and finally, I think I saw him sort of leading up to the playoffs or in the playoffs. The Pirates, he helped the Pirates get to the playoffs. There was that first incredible run the Pirates had back in 2013. And I asked him finally again, like, "Hey, all right, you're no longer on the team. The season's pretty much over. What's the deal?" So finally he lets out his secret, which he had spent the whole winter, the winter before, working on hitting with a guy by the name of Doug Latta, who was a former swimming pool repairman who happened to own a batting cage in a warehouse outside of LA. And this guy, according to Marlon Byrd, taught him more about hitting in the swing than anybody he had ever met at any level of baseball, including Major League Baseball. So that was insane. That completely haunted me because I didn't understand how it was possible. I couldn't fathom how a major league hitter, a good one, not a great one, but a long tenured major league player, could say that he learned more about hitting from this random dude than any major league hitting coach he'd ever had. And I kind of just put it in the back of my mind. It kind of stuck with me. And then suddenly, as we came back for 2014, we started hearing more stories like that. Justin Turner has his big breakout with Los Angeles, and JD Martinez goes to Detroit and has his big breakout. And more, I started hearing people talking about these stories. Justin Turner also went to Doug Latta, and JD Martinez had this other guy in California that he was working with. Then 2015 comes, and 2015, I think, was the real moment where everything changed for me in terms of, okay, there's a story here. It was at the Home Run Derby. It was in Cincinnati, 2015. I was there. Josh Donaldson was in the Home Run Derby, another guy that had sort of come out of nowhere to become a great player. Josh Donaldson, that Home Run Derby, if you remember, had Bobby Tewksbury throwing to him, pitching to him at the Home Run Derby, another just a random guy who never played in minor league or Major League Baseball, who owned a batting cage in New Hampshire, who somehow had helped Josh Donaldson enough to the point that Donaldson asked him to throw to him in the Derby. And that's when I realized, okay, we've now heard this story from a whole bunch of different players and a whole bunch of different coaches involved. Clearly, there's something there. So when I had the opportunity in 2017, after moving from the Mets beat to the national beat, I wrote an article about it in the Journal. And very quickly, I think we realized there was more still to tell. And that was the beginning of the book. So it's been a long journey, but here we are.
So, what was that moment like? Or did you remember a moment maybe you had when you're writing that article or doing reporting when you realized that this is the book and this is the book you're going to write?
I wish I could say I was that smart and that I had this epiphany moment, but it's not quite how it happened. I wrote the story for the Journal, and I knew it was a good story. It was a story I was really excited about. When I got put on the national beat, this was the story I was most excited about writing that spring. I was so jazzed about it. I just, I had a whole list of spring stories I wanted to do, but this was the one that was at the top. So I knew it was a good story, and it was one I was excited about. And that's when I first met some of my characters, like the Craig Wallenbrox and Doug Latta. The story runs, and it gets pretty good play. And that, I think it was literally the day after the story ran, the day the story did run in the newspaper, the day after it ran online, I got an email from my agent, Lauren Sharp, who is a genius and a visionary. She sent me an email, sort of out of nowhere, saying, I read your story and I think this could be a great book. And I had gotten emails like this before. I think anyone that writes, especially for the Journal, any big publication, if you write a story that's good, you're probably going to hear from a literary agent because that's what they do. They read stories and look for authors. And I had taken meetings about things before and met agents, and I never went forward. There was always a different reason every time why I didn't really think the story worked or I didn't connect with the agent. Whatever reason, I never pursued it. But you always take the meeting, right? You should always take the meeting, no matter what it is. So Lauren and I got a drink the next night, the day after she emailed me. The next afternoon, she's based in DC, but she comes up to New York often to meet with authors, and we met. And I'm thinking to myself, where's this going to go? This isn't going to go anywhere. I've had this meeting before. How is this really a book? I would say within 5 minutes of meeting Lauren, I knew that we had something because she was so incredibly enthusiastic, but two, she had a vision. Lauren laid out the book in a way where I said, oh my God, this is something. The way she described how this story could be something more. So by the end of that meeting, there was no question in my mind I was going to pursue it. And that's when we started the process of writing a proposal, which is a very long process. This first meeting happened in March of 2017, mid-March 2017. We didn't finish the proposal until probably wrap it up, probably December of 2017. That's a long time.
Yeah.
We sent it out right after New Year's in 2018. We started hearing back. We had meetings in mid to late January of 2018. That was another thing that surprised me at the process, how these meetings go. I didn't realize that we did all the meetings in one day. And we just went rapid fire from publisher to publisher to publisher. And then I thought, okay, well, we'll probably hear back in a few weeks. No, they all decide within a day or two if they're going to bid for the book.
Oh, wow.
So it was a whirlwind process. We ended up selling the book to HarperCollins, William Morrow, which is a HarperCollins imprint in late January of 2018. So that's what, 10 months after the original story. That's how long the process was. So it was a journey, but it happened. But yeah, that meeting with Lauren, that first drink we had was really, that was the moment where I was like, okay, I'm on board because you're selling me on this.
Mm-hmm. So what does the proposal look like, and how much work and reporting goes into that proposal over the 6-7 months or however long you're writing it? What's in that was so meaningful and important? What did that document look like?
It's not quite the process of writing the book, but it's not as far away from writing the actual book as you might think.
Okay.
It's long. It's a long document. It's, conservatively, you could say 50 to 70 pages. It's a lot of work, and it requires starting you're reporting. You're not doing all of it, but basically what you're doing with this proposal is selling your idea, that this is an idea that could be a book and would sell. You're selling yourself, that I have a big enough audience already to sort of write a book that would sell, and that I'm the person to tell the story. And you're selling that this is an idea that's possible, that you could actually execute it, that you have access to the sources and the characters that you need, and you have the ability to actually do the reporting to turn this into a book. So that's a lot to try to put into a document. You have to write a sample chapter. You have to put clips that you've written already. You have to, write a whole chapter outline, which I admit turned out to be nothing like what the book actually was, but you have to still try. So it took months and it was long and I had no idea how to do it. So fortunately I had a really great agent who was holding my hand and sort of helping me through it, because I've never done this before.
Right.
But it's a good process, because I feel like when you're writing the proposal, or at least with this proposal, you start seeing, okay, this is what the book's going to look like, and this is actually feasible, and I actually have 12 chapters or 15 or 10 or however many chapters worth of material here. So it's good to sort of put your thoughts on paper. I don't think it really matters. I don't think the publishers actually expect the chapter outline to stay be the actual book,
right?
Because the reporting takes you where it takes you. But it's still a good process to be like, okay, this is actually doable, because my articles for the journal are 1,000 words, more give or take, 1,200, 900, in that realm of 1,000 words. The book is 90,000 words, 95,000 words. And it's funny because I remember being in spring training in 2018, shortly after I sold the book, and I was at Dodgers camp in Glendale, Arizona, and I was talking to Justin Turner, who I've known for a long time. He was on the Mets in 2013. He's a main character in the book, and I'm telling him I have to do this book. And I said, I'm kind of nervous because my articles are 1,000 words. This has to be 90,000 words. And he just looks at me very calmly and says, well, you just have to write 90 articles. And I said, well, yeah, that's like me telling you to get 180 hits, but in a week instead in 6 months. But I guess it was good advice at the end of the day.
I was gonna say, like, in a way, yeah, that's kind of a natural way to look at it. I think to break it down into smaller chunks that we as newspaper people or magazine people are more kind of familiar with. On the other hand, I would imagine, in talking to authors, I've heard this, that the challenge is, in a book, there's got to be that through line, right? There's got to be like that big idea that connects everything. So it's not just 12 different articles or whatever, 15 different articles, like you said, like they're all part of a bigger story. So I'm interested in that, in the writing and the organizing and the reporting, like the big idea of this book. What is the big idea? How did you kind of come to it and organize the book around it?
So I knew what the big idea was going to be, which is that there's a revolution happening in baseball that's changing the entire industry in terms of how people swing. But specifically, it's about the unusual place where the innovation started, which is these outside mad scientists hitting coaches, and how that could happen, and what that says about not just baseball, but business and industry in general, that that sort of creation or that sort of idea generating could originate in such a strange place. Because I imagined, and I believe this to be true, if that's something that could happen anywhere, not just in baseball. There's a reason why, Facebook started in a dorm room and Apple Computer started in a garage, because sometimes it takes people that are not sort of bound by bureaucracy and tradition to break the norm and try something different and do something amazing. So that was what I knew I wanted the big idea to be. What I didn't know is how that would actually look in a book. And the answer was, at the beginning, I didn't really worry about it for a long time. Once I narrowed down who I was going to be writing about, I narrowed it down to 4 coaches, each of whom are sort of known for one particular player or 2 particular players. I said, okay, these are the most interesting people. I'm going to write about these people. They're going to be the focus of the book. The first thing I did was just say, okay, here's 4 documents. I have my Doug Latta document. He's Justin Turner and Marlon Byrd's coach. I have my Craig Wallenbrock document. That was JD Martinez's coach. Let's just start, as I gather reporting and all of this, just start writing it. Don't worry about the structure. Don't worry about how it all ties together. Just just write as if you're writing a very long magazine article on each of these people. So that's what I did. I just wrote it all with no real sense of order at the beginning. I just put it on the page. I had some ideas here and there. There were some places where obviously things connected. So I started kind of making notes. And I just wrote it all. And then I had like 105,000 words. And then it became, okay, let's take a stab at organizing this. How does this all fit together? I had to then sort of go back and write transitions and find ways, sort of massage it together. But there was a little Frankenstein's monstering where I kind of stitched together all these different pieces. It was the most challenging part of the process. My editor at HarperCollins helped helped a lot with that. He, at some point, I got to the point eventually where I'm like, I just need another set of eyes on this. And I've been the only one looking at it for 18 months. I need somebody else to tell me like what you start losing perspective on what's good and what's not anymore. Everything just seems like it all blurs together. I'm like, what part of this is actually good? But it all worked out at the end. Like, I don't think it's confusing. That was my biggest concern, was like, is it confusing, like following these different stories at different parts throughout? But unfortunately, I've not heard anyone say that. So I'm confident it's not. But yeah, it kind of was at the end. It was the very, very last thing I did was stitch it together. I knew, but the big idea, that was sort of at the beginning. I knew what that was going to be. It was just how to weave together these stories to arrive at the big idea. My biggest problem, interestingly, and I had been warned about this. I had totally been warned about this by my agent and my editor with journalists who write books, is that they want to put all the good stuff at the top. Because that's what we're used to doing. Right. And I write an article, I'm trying to get you with my lead. I need to put all the good stuff at the top, and then the bottom is like you don't worry as much about the bottom often. But in the book, they had to keep telling me like, no, you got to save stuff back. You need to have an arc. It needs to have a dramatic ending, like in a movie. So I tried really hard to do that, and then still they said you're putting too much good stuff at the top. So we have some sections that were like, I think we have a few sections in the book now that are like 2/3 of the way through that in my early drafts were, in the first chapter.
Okay. You mentioned the word characters a few times, and you're talking about these four coaches that kind of provide the arc of your book. I wanted to ask about reporting that, but also using the word character. Like, how important is the sense that thinking of them as characters, not subjects, not people you're writing, not sources, I guess is what we would in journalism, but as characters. How important was that for you?
It was crucial. And when I didn't realize that at the beginning. I was still thinking of them just as my sources. But then I realized one of the big differences between the book and a story is like, this has to have sort of a different sort of narrative arc. And these people they're not just giving you information. They are sort of the drivers of the entire story. And the relationship was different. Like it was much more me working with them than working sort of not against them, but sort of tangentially to them. Like with a source, there's a much bigger wall up between you and the source when you're working on a story. In this book, you're really working. I felt like I was working with them directly, and like we were sort of in it together, which is a relationship you would never want for a story for the journal, because you sort of lose your objectivity and you're giving them too much freedom and to sort of shape the story. But in the book, that was okay. You want them to be in there helping you shape the story. And they were a big part of it. And I was in the story myself, which is also something you would never do at the journal. But once I realized, okay, think of it as a movie. Like, imagine someone's going to turn this book into a movie. Just pretend. You never know. It could happen. Anything's possible. What would that movie be? Well, that's when I realized, okay, like Craig Wallenbrock, JD Martinez's coach, he is the most interesting person here. If one were to make a movie, he'd probably be at the forefront of it. So think about that as you write. So it was sort of important to recognize that, okay, this is a story. Yes, it's a true story. It's 100% nonfiction, but it's a story nonetheless, and it needs to have arc, and characters need to sort of grow and change and develop, and there needs to be sort of a resolution at the end and a conflict. And it was good to recognize that.
Did you have any issues with the main people wanting to be interviewed or wanting to talk about this kind of thing?
Yes and no. Various people, yes, various people, no. With the coaches themselves, it was for the most part not too difficult. These are people that don't get written about a lot, and we're pretty thrilled to share their stories. In fact, I had to deal with having a lot of random people, coaches hitting people, sort of trying to get me to put them in the book once they heard that I was doing it. There are a lot of people out there on the internet that claim to have the answers to the swing who would be very happy to tell you about it if you just give them the chance. Dealing with players is always a bit of an issue, some more than others. Not all the players I would have wanted participated in the book. JD Martinez, I had spent over a year trying to nail him down for the amount of time I needed him. Eventually did, and it was great. He was probably the most fun interview in the whole book. But others didn't. Aaron Judge is a big part of the book. He's in it throughout the entire book. He's really an important figure. He did not talk to me for the book. I don't want to say why, because the reason why is very interesting and is part of the actual story. It's in the book as to why Aaron Judge didn't want to participate, so it's a little bit of a spoiler. But he had a very good reason for not wanting to go on the record and talk in this book, and but that was still a struggle trying to deal with that. But that's part of your job, is like, that not everyone that you want to talk to you is going to talk to you, and that just puts the pressure on you to find other people that could sort of fill in those gaps. And I hope that those subjects, if those people, if Aaron Judge ever were to read the book, which I'm sure he won't, he would say that everything in it about him is accurate and what actually happened, as he would say.
What's the most neatest thing, I guess, weird way of putting it, but what's the neatest thing you learned about the baseball swing in writing this book? Because I'm always fascinated, especially with athletes, when you talk about the swing or a jump shot or a pitching motion, something like that, something that's very technical, at just how technical it is and how much these athletes think about it and obsess over it. And a lot of times, I'm like, maybe not Aaron Judge, but a lot of times they love when somebody takes an interest and really wants to talk to them about it. So what was maybe one or two of the most interesting things or coolest things that you learned about just the swing in general and baseball players?
It just blew my mind how little we really knew about it, or how what had been taught for so long, just how wrong and nonsensical it was. I mean, I played baseball through high school. I think anyone that played even Little League at some point was told that you want to swing down, that you want to hit the top of the ball, that you want to be short to the ball, all these cues that we all heard. And you think about it a little more, which I guess I never did until I started working on this, and you realize how ridiculous it is. Like, why would you want a swing that's designed to hit the ball on the ground? It makes absolutely no sense. Like, there's no one picks up a bat for the first time when you're 3 years old and gets thrown a wiffle ball with a plastic bat in your apartment and thinks, I want to hit the ball on the ground.
Right.
No, you want to hit it as far away as you possibly can and try to break something on the other side of the room. That's just what any natural person would want to do. And then when they start playing baseball, they're told, actually want to swing down, hit the ball on the ground. It makes no sense, but you hear it so much that you just stop being objective about it. You stop thinking about it. And the idea now that we're like very aware with numbers and because of technology and data, that hitting the ball in the air is so far superior to hitting the ball on the ground, it just blows my mind that it took as long as it did for this way of thinking to sort of enter the mainstream. Especially, and you go back 50 years ago to 1970, Ted Williams writes The Science of Hitting, which is like the Bible of hitting. This was, again, 50 years ago. And he writes in that book that you want to swing up and not down. And all these people saying to swing down are wrong, and they're idiots and they're stupid. Ted Williams was pretty gruff. He didn't tolerate fools very, very well. That's one thing I learned working on this book, because I never obviously got to see Ted Williams play. He said that 50 years ago, and yet it's like nobody listened until more recently. And that was another one of those sort of like real mysteries to me that I try to work through in the book, which is, if the best hitter of all time perhaps knew this 50 years ago, why did it take till 2014 before mainstream hitters started listening to it?
Right. So any ideas why? Or I know it's definitely in the book, but why is that?
There's a few reasons. I can't say I know the answer, but I know there are a few reasons that made sense to me when I asked this question to many people. One is this idea of what I started calling like the he's a freak syndrome, which is this idea that like, okay, well, that is weird and it clearly works for Ted Williams, but Ted Williams is the freak. Ted Williams is better, just a better hitter and a better athlete than the average Joe, and the average Joe couldn't do that. It wouldn't work. So the average Joe has to model himself after this other guy that has a more classic swing, leave that sort of wild, incredible, weirdo swing to the freak Ted Williams. I think there's something to be said about that. I think part of it goes back to the origins of baseball. If you go back to the very, 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 very beginning of professional baseball, the late 19th century, very early 20th century, like the dead ball era, there was a reason to hit the ball on the ground. The ball was not designed to travel in the air at that time. If there really weren't home runs, if there were fences, there were either no fence or the fence at some fields, were 600 feet away. You're just playing on sort of empty expanses of grass and dirt. There was no real thought of like hitting the ball out of the ballpark. And fielders, by the way, didn't wear gloves, or when they started wearing gloves, they were very rudimentary. So errors were extremely common on balls on the ground, not as much on balls in the air. It was easier to sort of catch a ball in the air, even with no glove, than it was to field a bouncing ball on sort of a very poorly kept field with no glove. And then you had to throw it to somebody else that wasn't wearing a glove or was wearing a very mediocre glove. So if you look at through the history of baseball, the most errors in a season in Major League Baseball history, they are all the earliest seasons, like pre-1920, basically. If you go and you look this up, it's pretty easy to find. I think the top 35 seasons in errors in the history of baseball were 1917 and earlier, which tells you all you need to know. Well, that sticks, right? Well, you're teaching players to do that. And how do people teach? They teach what they were taught. And it gets passed on through generations and generations before them. So you had people teaching their children and their players to do this, and it sort of worked for them. And then that just sort of stuck sort of forever. And there was always this big debate over what baseball should be as well. Babe Ruth comes. Now I'm just getting so into the weeds, but Babe Ruth obviously bursts onto the scene in 1920. The live ball era starts. He's swatting balls over fences and captivating the nation. He's making the home run sexy. But then you have this whole group of people like Ty Cobb and many others who said this is not the way to play baseball. This is brutish. This is unrefined. This is aesthetically displeasing. And real baseball involves being an artist and sort of guiding the ball, not just swatting it as far as you can. So all of these things I think tied together to create this world where like, okay, the swing is this. And it took until somewhat recently for people to think, well, maybe it's something else.
It's funny, the hitting the ball on the ground because the fielders don't wear gloves or have it. That's such an analytics mindset. Like that's like the first market inefficiency in baseball is you don't hit it on in the air, you hit it on the ground because that's going to increase your chances of winning. It's so funny to me when you see old examples of what's basically using analytics, but they get poo-pooed because they're new stats or whatever. I think that's a super interesting way to think about it.
And it wasn't just old baseball. Think about if you played Little League, which I certainly did, you probably did too. Think about that was also the case when you were a kid. Because hitting a ball on the ground, that was like a multi-step process to field.
Right.
The person would have to successfully field the ground ball. They would then have to throw it across the field successfully. And then it would have to be caught by the first baseman. And you're talking about 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. They often couldn't do that. So there's this big debate in the youth baseball world now about do we teach like process versus result? And do we teach hitting the ball in the air when you're 8 years old may actually lead to worse results unless you're smashing the ball over everybody's head, because it's easier to catch fly balls than it is to field grounders when you're a small child. But the teaching that ground ball swing may end up hurting the kid in the long run. So what's the right approach? It's an interesting sort of debate that youth baseball coaches are sort of into now. I have my own opinion on it. Personally, I think you just teach kids to have fun. And if that means hitting the ball on the ground and just do it, because 99% of these kids aren't actually going to make it to the major leagues. But I also realize there's high level crazy youth baseball coaches that see it differently. So, but yeah, this idea of like we're always using analytics, we just didn't have a word for them or numbers to back them up. Yeah, of course. I mean, remember they were shifting on Ted Williams in the 40s because they just knew intuitively that he hit the ball to the right side more than to the left.
Right.
But because now we call them analytics, people freak out.
Right. So I wanted to ask you about the dedication to the book, because this is unlike any dedication I've ever seen or can remember seeing. Your dedication is to all the people ever told they weren't good enough. That's a fascinating thing to dedicate your book to. Where'd that come from?
It's a good question. Where did it come from? I know like the classic thing to do is you dedicate a book to one person or to a group of people or family, friends, parents, wife, all of which would have been fine. But you have the acknowledgement section where I knew I was able to write something nice about all of these people. And I thought a lot while working on the book. This didn't come to me till toward the end of the process. I'm writing this book and I realized, who are these people that I'm writing about? And talking to some people that had great success, like JD Martinez and others and all these great players. I also, in the book, are a lot of people who failed, people who thought they should have been better, and weren't, or were told that it wasn't going to work for them, or things were not happening when they thought they would. And those stories really resonated with me. These people who really had their careers cut short or didn't pan out the way they wanted. And that's really what the book is about. The book is about players and coaches who were sort of at the end of their careers, or at the end of their ropes, were going to be on the way out of the industry, and had to sort of prove to people that wasn't true by doing some pretty weird things. And it struck me that that's not just a baseball only problem, that there's people everywhere who, are told that they can't do something, that they aren't good enough, that it's too late for them, that their time has passed. And I think as I was writing the book, I realized that one of the big messages of it is that that's not true, that it isn't too late, that, you might be able to achieve more than you believe. And yeah, not everyone could be a major leaguer, but that doesn't mean you can't get better, that you can't improve, that there isn't more in the tank, that the ceiling that you thought you have in any endeavor doesn't have to be your ceiling. You could raise it. You could push that ceiling up, because that's what different about this, what's happening now versus Moneyball. Moneyball was about finding people that were better than people realized, that had skills that were not being valued and were actually better at the task than anyone sort of was recognizing. But what this story is about, and what's happening now, is not about finding people that are better than we thought. It's about taking people and actually making them better than they are, than they ever were, than they could have been. And it proves that you have more in the tank. You still have more to give if you A, believe it, not to sound too sappy, and B, figure out how, find the right technique, find the right person to help you do it. And I thought, well, these are the people that I want to write this book for. Because I think it applies to everybody, not just baseball players and not just elite people, but everyone has something in their life, I think, where they gave up or were told their time had passed.
So I ask everybody on the podcast this, so I'll ask you, what's the best thing you've read lately?
Best thing I've read lately? I've been reading a lot of very sad articles about COVID-19, which honestly is just it's very depressing, if I'm being totally honest. But so on the very, 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 very short term, this is very sad, but I've been reading a lot of the tributes to Anthony Causi, the New York Post photographer who very sadly died of coronavirus on Sunday. That was very devastating, but I've been reading a lot of the tributes to him. I also read this really amazing magazine story called The Woman on the Bridge in The Cut. That was this long form sort of story about, well, it's kind of hard even to explain. It's so interesting, about this woman who had jumped off the Williamsburg Bridge or Brooklyn Bridge in the 60s. And it was a very famous photo of her. And the story of it was different than anyone had ever known for all this time. Very, very fascinating. It's weird because there's so much good stuff out there right now. Oh, and books. I haven't talked about books. Well, Buzzsaw, of course. Can't forget about Buzzsaw in terms of baseball books, and The Wax Pack, another really great baseball book that's out there now. And I'm very excited about the Yogi biography that I think came out last week or maybe comes out tomorrow. It either just came out or it's coming out. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm excited about that. I think it's just called Yogi.
Okay.
I think it's just called Yogi. I could be wrong.
Oh, that's a person just ripe for a great biography. That's going to be.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been one.
No, I can think of. Yeah. So I can recommend two things since we're all reading a lot more or have more time to. I just started The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. Never read it. Huge gap. Gonna read it. Loving it so far. And also, my friend, and I think you were coworkers with him for a brief time, Mike Sealski. He's at the Philadelphia Inquirer. He wrote a brilliant column last week.
That was great.
It was about Bobby McIlvaine and him being reconnected after the death of Kobe Bryant. Just a beautiful newspaper column.
Yeah, I did see that. That was awesome. Mike Sealski and I were colleagues when I first started the Journal, and he's amazing.
He is. And I'll have links to all of these in show notes, and I'll have links to Swing Kings in there as well. I'll have it at Amazon, and then IndieBound and Bookshops.org, and all the other places. Jared, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.